Well, welcome everybody. We're going to make a start, I think, and then I think a few more people will filter in as we begin. My name is Nick Jepson. I'm from the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute. This is the second in our series of sort of autumn talks for CHERN Working Group 6. If you are new to CHERN, this is the China and Europe Research Network. We're a network that's been around about, what, 6-7 years or so now. Kind of scholars, mostly around Europe, but certainly from beyond. We've had a little bit of a kind of rejigging and restructuring in the past year or so. One part of which has been to introduce this relatively new working group, which I'm heading up, which is on energy and energy, transition, extraction, natural resources. And the idea here partly is to sort of broaden the scope a little bit. So it's certainly interested in China and Europe still, Europe in China, but also expanding it to the kind of global stage and thinking about areas in which, Europe may compete or possibly cooperate or at least interact with Chinese actors outside of Europe and China. And with that regard, today we are very pleased to have Professor Thea Riofrancos with us, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College, and also the Strategic Director of the Climate and Community Institute and a Fellow of the Transnational Institute. I know her work, first came across it, her work on Ecuador, but the Resource Radicals from Duke University Press. She's also the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, which is out with Verso. Academically, her work has also appeared in journals such as Perspectives on Politics, World Politics, and Global Environmental Politics. And she is probably known to many of you from her work appearing in outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, DFT, Foreign Policy, M+1, Dissent, Jacobin, NACLA, and many more. And I could go on for another 5 or 10 minutes, but I do want to give her a chance to speak. So with that, very pleased to introduce Thea Riofrancos. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for the warm introduction, and Alexandra for coordinating all of this. Give me a moment, and I'm just going to share my screen to get started with some slides that will kind of accompany my talk. Okay. Okay. So yes, as Nicholas mentioned, I will be giving a talk on my recently published book, which came out in late September, both in the US and UK, and will be coming out in Germany and some other markets in the months to come. So I know that this is a network and people are in different countries in the world, so I just wanted to mention that. But yes, the book is called Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, and this talk will sort of be a 20,000-foot view of sorts, in the sense that I want to address most of the major themes in the book in about 45 minutes. That means I won't get into equal detail on everything, but I have tried to present a number of concrete examples and visual visual information to kind of hopefully make this feel palpable, even if it's kind of a broad overview. So without further ado, I will get into the book and start with kind of what its main topics are and what are the immediate questions that I tackle and that are raised on the book's pages. So as is not surprising from the title and from Nicholas's introduction, the main set of topics of my book are the intersection between resource extraction and the energy transition. When I started this topic several years ago, it really wasn't as salient in academia. At this point, there's a much bigger conversation around it, both in academia and, of course, in public policy. And that's because there's growing awareness of how much mining might be required by the energy transition that is so urgently necessary. one way to kind of get a snapshot of this is to look at what forecasting agencies or commodity analytics firms say. And here I'm relying on benchmark mineral intelligence, but we could have similar graphics from the International Energy Association or the World Bank, and other governmental agencies. And what this is displaying to us is the mining required to create the number of electric vehicle batteries that will be required that will be demanded, that are in turn required to draw down emissions from the transportation sector. And so this is really just a subset of the overall mining associated with the energy transition. It's just looking at the battery of the car. It's not even looking at the rest of the car, steel or aluminum for the car's body or the electric motor. This is just the battery. And just for the battery, Benchmark Mineral predicts that we'll need almost 400 new mines globally by 2035. A subset of these, in turn, is those lithium mines at the top. And that's, in the order of, let's say, around 70 new mines being required there. There is a range, but and that's millions more tons of lithium needed in addition to the lithium that's already being mined. What I think is important to kind of point out immediately, and that gets at the heart of some of the dilemmas and conflicts that I cover in the book, is that, this is a very abstract way to present it. Each of the mines is like a little dot or a little graphic, like a kind of clip art mine, that you see, on the right side of the graphic. But, immediately, for anyone who has thought more about mining or studied it, or maybe even visited a mine, mines are enormous imprints, enormous physical and material footprints on landscapes. And the idea of there being 400 more of them just to satisfy, again, like a subset of the energy transition, therefore becomes more contentious and concerning when we think about these mines in physical places. This, for example, is an aerial image of one of the sets of mines that I cover in my book, which is in the Atacama Desert in Chile. These are enormous evaporation ponds that is concentrating the lithium-rich liquid that is found underneath the ground of this enormous salt flat in Chile, the Atacama Salt Flat, which is where about a fifth of the world's lithium comes from currently. Of course, an extractive frontier, as I try to describe in the book, is extraction, and not just a site of sacrifice and dispossession. It is those things, but it's also a place of non-human nature, habitats, and ecosystems, which may very well be harmed by mining. And that's very much the case here. These beautiful flamingos that we see on top of the salt crust. And this is photos from a nature preserve that are about 30 kilometers away from that mine. Those birds and their populations are being affected by mining. The populations are being decreased, along with broader concerns about biodiversity in the region and the effect of extraction on that biodiversity. And yet life persists. So this is an extractive frontier. It is also a habitat and a really fascinating ecological system and water system. In addition to the extraction, the habitats, the water system, the biodiversity, there is also human life here, of course. And so around the Atacama Salt Flat, which is, by the way, the third largest salt flat in the world and the largest in Chile, there are 18 indigenous communities specifically that live around the salt flat. And there are many more indigenous communities in the region that also live near other salt flats that are currently under potential for being mined in the future. And what we've seen is that the mining of lithium, alongside the mining and processing of copper, alongside the climate crisis that is unfolding and affecting the Atacama Desert, which is already the world's driest desert, is impacting the accessibility of water to these communities and therefore their ability to irrigate and farm in the ways that they have ancestrally for millennia. And so this is just one landscape, one set of mines, one set of supply chains for the energy transition. But it raises the question of, why are these particular minerals so important to the energy transition? And maybe in particular, since my focus in the book is lithium, what is so important about lithium that merits its vast expansion as a sector, and also is part of the kind of dilemma and trade-off that we have to weigh against the environmental and social impacts of its mining that I just mentioned? And so lithium is referred to as a quote critical mineral for the energy transition. I'll define that term in a moment, but just to kind of begin a bit more straightforwardly, the reason that lithium is so important and set to expand as a sector so dramatically is that it's currently the most important ingredient in lithium ion batteries, which are themselves the prevailing approach to decarbonizing our transportation sector as well as our energy sector. So, with transportation, this is about electric mobility and the role of lithium ion batteries to allow for zero emissions energy to be stored in a battery and then power a bus or a vehicle or a light truck or a bike, for example, right? So that's the transportation sector role. And in the US, which is where I'm speaking from, transportation is our highest emitting sector. In the global kind of scenario, transportation is the second highest emitting. That's behind the power sector. In the power sector, lithium batteries also play an important role, which is stabilizing and calibrating supply and demand of intermittent energy sources. So, in more plain English, sun and wind are not always shining or blowing. And so that means you have to store energy, even if just for a few hours, so that you can capture the energy when it's available and then deploy it when it's being demanded by consumers or businesses. And large scale lithium ion batteries play an increasingly important role in stabilizing renewable energy based grids. And so for these reasons, we have an expectation that every agency that forecasts these things finds, which is that lithium will go way up in terms of demand and already has over the past few years. A lot of what drives that demand, no pun intended, I guess, is on the right side of the graph, where the blue bar shows us that the majority of this demand, and this will increasingly be the case, comes from individual electric vehicles, which is important to keep in mind because there are other ways that we can think about decarbonizing the transportation sector that might also reduce how much lithium is needed in total. And that will be how I end the talk. So I will circle back to that point. But as I said, in addition to mobility, we also have the fact that stationary storage is a growing source of demand for lithium as well. On the one hand, this growing demand from a supply and demand perspective is not necessarily a problem because there actually is a lot of lithium on Earth. It's one of the more abundant elements. It takes a wide variety of forms. It's in the Earth's crust. It's in water, as I said, the brine water, the salty lithium water that's underneath those salt flats in Chile. There's even lithium in the ocean, though it's very low concentration. But as many people in this room who have studied extraction probably know, just because a mineral is relatively abundant doesn't necessarily mean that the production levels always keep up with market demand. And what we've seen in the case of lithium are these recurrent imbalances where for a few years, demand vastly exceeded market supplies. And then more recently, we've had a sort of glut, but a lot of analysts expect that to reverse again in the next few years. So we've had this recurrent volatility in the lithium market. And this just exemplifies that. We had the period on the left of dramatically high prices in the earlier part of this decade. And then as we got to 2023, but really especially more recently, 2024, 25, we've had this decline in prices. It's starting to plateau a bit and may rise again in the next year, but that's what we're looking at, are these price booms and price busts. And for all of these reasons, all of those bullet points that I've just gone through, this is why lithium is considered a quote critical mineral. It's seen by many states, many governments as essential to the economy because of its role in these advanced energy technologies and the energy transition. It's also, and this will be a whole section of the talk, so I won't say a ton about it at this moment, considered essential for quote national security. In addition, even though in this case supply isn't scarce in a geological sense, there has been this volatility in the market that has resulted in supply not always being available when it's demanded. And cobbling that together is basically the definition of a critical mineral, essential for the economy and or national security, and where there are concerns about supply, whether geological or market supply. But, as I think will become clear by the end of this talk, when states take a special interest in certain natural resources or minerals specifically, and label them as critical or strategic or essential, that isn't just a neutral or purely technical act. It also opens up new forms of state power, new vehicles for corporate and investor profitability, and therefore new sites of social but also geopolitical conflict. And so, in that sense, critical minerals like lithium are a lens onto the broader and still quite contentious and uneven political economy of the energy transition. And, just to kind of elaborate on this a little bit more, the way that I look at that political economy is through three sets of actors and their unequal but very dynamic interactions. So those actors are states, firms and investors, and social movements. And I want to just say right away, in case it's maybe to some people a little unusual to include social movements in a diagnosis of political economy, I think this will hopefully be, you'll hopefully be persuaded of this by the end of the talk, but just to preview it now, I do view social movements in these supply chains and in extractive frontiers in particular as actually extremely relevant to the fundamentals of political economy. And you'll see why by the end of the talk. But I include them alongside more elite actors like governments and firms and investors. The book that this is all based on was in turn based on quite a bit of field work. I won't dwell on this too much, but maybe just to mention one thing. I traditionally have studied Latin America. All of my research, really prior to this book, focused on Latin America. I have family connections there, but also it's just been a place where the politics of extraction are extremely salient and interesting. But this book, in ways that were unexpected, meaning they actually weren't planned at the outset, ended up taking me to Europe as well as to the United States, where I live, of course, and I've written about the US in more popular publications, and I do activism and advocacy in the US, but I hadn't ever done scholarly research on the US as a sort of case. And so this book is transnational. It focuses on Latin America, Europe, and the United States. But as we'll see, China, while not a place I conducted primary research, ends up being a pretty critical site of a lot of the causal processes that in turn affected European Union and American policymakers and how they have responded to the energy transition. So to start with, I want to turn to the role of states, and I will start, as you'll see in a moment, with states in the global north, with the European Union and US state. But just to motivate this a little bit, I think that, one reason I start with the role of government may be related to my training as a political scientist, but I think much more importantly than that, as we'll see, and as many in the audience are probably aware, states take a particularly important role in natural resources and extractive sectors, more so than in other sectors of the economy. So I think it's really impossible to study them without looking at state agencies and public policies, even if you think at the end of the day, the market actors, the investors, the corporations really hold a lot of the power. The state is an extremely important terrain of policymaking around extractive sectors, and therefore also a site of contention. And we see that social movements often try to organize on the terrain of the state and public policy as well in order to advance a different vision of the energy transition. So we're going to start with governments, and I guess we could say some of the powerful governments in the world, though their power has been a bit in question with the rise of China and the primacy of China in some of these supply chains. And this is just an example of the framing, the media coverage, but also the governmental framing of these, quote, critical minerals. And we see right away the strong link to national security, the framing of scarcity, even though that's not exactly empirical, and this kind of understanding that there's a race to dominate these sectors. These headlines, as you can see, at least in one of the cases, are from a few years ago, 2020, 2021, 2022. And, whenever I think to update the slide with new headlines, the headlines are like exactly the same, which I think speaks to the durability of these discourses, even as other world events change, and even as there are challenges to some of these ambitions of Western dominance to counter perceived Chinese dominance in these sectors. But that's kind of just a taste of how policymakers in the global north um, think about lithium and think about these critical minerals in general. But I want to kind of step back and historicize these discourses a little bit, and then I'll come back into the present to look at what the policies look like in more detail. So we might ask, like, why are policymakers in some of the most powerful countries on earth so concerned about their ability to access critical minerals like lithium? And I think to fully understand that, we have to go back in time a little bit to the 1970s, which was, in a way, a parallel moment, as I argue in the book, of Western elite concern about access to essential resources. In that case, primarily oil, but also minerals at that moment as well. This was a moment in history where what we could call third world resource nationalism, and I use that term advisedly of third world because that's how those countries were labeled at the time, but also how they identified themselves in many cases. So there was a rise of resource nationalism, the nationalization of resource sectors, the foundation of state-owned companies, the intervention of the state in resource sectors. That was really on the rise in this moment, and in some senses, it was the height of those political ambitions and attempts. In reaction to that, the global north, especially in reaction to the formation of OPEC and to the upward pressure on oil prices and the idea that there was an energy crisis, the global north policymakers, particularly in the US and UK, start to talk about how they need energy security and independence, and they need to have their own access to energy resources that doesn't route through what they considered to be unreliable global south governments. And so that was a moment where you actually got a kind of wave of new investment and development of oil extraction in the global north. So whether we look at Alaska or the Gulf of Mexico in the US, or we look at the North Sea of the UK, that was really the moment that global north policymakers said we need to onshore oil, which is really, relevant to today and the onshoring of mining, as we'll come to in a moment. So the next kind of inflection point, we might say, was many decades later in 2008, which was another moment that the West or Western policymakers really felt like the world was escaping their control. There was obviously the financial crisis, which undercut the legitimacy of neoliberalism, which in many ways was a kind of set of policies sold by the West and adopted by the West, but also pushed on other countries. But, at the same time, 2008 wasn't just a moment of financial crisis. It was also a moment of an economic boom in a lot of the world linked to China's domestic economic boom. So in China, we have this rapid process of industrialization underway, which in turn demands a lot of raw materials to kind of feed the machines, but also more directly feed the consumer markets of China. And that itself means that there's a lot of demand for all sorts of raw materials, whether oil or copper or soy or beef. And those raw materials are coming from the global south, which means that there's an economic boom in a lot of the global south at that time. So it was a moment of crisis for the West, but not necessarily crisis everywhere. But in addition, and more to our point today, it was a moment that Western policymakers started to worry about their ability to access these raw materials because, in their view, China was like gobbling up world supplies and making them more expensive, while at the same time it was moving up the value chain. So there was like this double threat from China that it was, again, in this Western framework, like kind of monopolizing raw materials and also in so doing, industrializing in ways that changed its position in the world system and directly threatened Western primacy. So just to kind of accelerate and move along and closer to the present, we of course have Trump's government in 2016, his first government, where the trade war with China really takes off. He also starts to make some forays into critical mineral onshoring. He adds lithium to the list of critical minerals to the catalog that the US government keeps. He fast tracks some critical mineral mining projects, some of which are under construction today. And so he kind of accelerates this process of the West onshoring and thinking in geostrategic terms about raw materials markets and access. And then this picks up further pace in 2019 before the pandemic, but then picks up pace during the pandemic, during as Russia invades Ukraine and there's a massive energy shock. There are also food market shocks. There are a variety of shocks to raw material markets, but there's also the accelerating energy transition. And so the US and Europe are increasingly worried that they have lost out to China in the kind of forefront of this transition, and that means they should really build domestic supply chains for energy transition technologies, starting with mining, but also, of course, manufacturing. And so there are parallel moves in the US, in the EU to onshore lithium mining, onshore battery production, and EV production. And today, this will come up a little bit later in a moment in the talk, but Trump is in some ways in his second government today in the US disrupting this, or not, of course, not as focused on an energy transition, or perhaps even hostile to an energy transition, but he is in other ways going along with this broader consensus that critical minerals are important to geostrategic power. So that's a bit of a timeline of how we got to the present. And what I argue in the book, but also in a related academic article, is that what we see in Europe and the US is the rise of, we could call it industrial policy, but it's a very corporate friendly version of industrial policy that's a bit different than actually the Chinese approaches that they are seemingly competing with, but maybe not as well developed or as well planned as those Chinese industrial policies, which also have much more room for disciplining of capital, for capital controls, for the state to be more of a protagonist in a variety of ways. But the Western version of this involves a lot of tax breaks, a lot of subsidies, some degree of regulatory fast tracking. Also can involve, in certain moments, forms of direct public ownership as well, though. So that's a bit more of a kind of full-throated version of industrial policy, which I'll come to in a moment. There's also been this rhetorical and to a degree policy emphasis of that the West is also a more sustainable or ethical place to mine compared to either China or the global South. And so there is this, we could call it greenwashing. In the EU, it's probably a bit more than greenwashing. There are actual adopted policies that require, for example, increasing recycling of lithium batteries as a way to supply lithium without new mining. So there's also this kind of green or sustainability aspect to this broader push to onshore mining and these supply chains. And so what I argue in the book and in that related article is that this is clearly a response on the part of policy elites to the perceived dominance of China. It also, though, advances the interests of firms on the supply chain, which are very happy to get tax breaks or forms of public financing and de-risking in order to support their economic activities and investments. And they're also perfectly happy for governments to claim that mining in the West is responsible and sustainable. And so when they open their mines in the West, that, there will be that kind of reputational benefit as well. And so maybe just a little bit more on what these policies have looked like, because they are really a dramatic shift in terms of global North policymakers wanting to encourage mining within the global North. So we have all sorts of kind of incentives for new mines in the global North, in order for manufacturers to obtain certain tax credits, or for consumers to obtain rebates. This is under the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. More domestic content, domestic mineral content needed to be added to those, end-use technologies and to their supply chains, with the Critical Raw Materials Act, which sets out certain benchmarks and goals in Europe for increasing mining in Europe, right? And so this is, quite a clear policy on the part of Western policymakers. In addition, they are using protectionism or tariffs to kind of protect these infant industries in the West and protect them particularly from Chinese competition. And as I said, I would get to, there's also quite a bit of public financing, whether that takes the form of de-risking, whether that takes the form of more direct investment. So, for example, really recently, and perhaps in a move that could be a bit perplexing, the Trump government itself is taking direct ownership stakes in a variety of critical minerals companies, including a lithium company. So that's all the way at the bottom. That same lithium company and their project in the southwestern United States also received direct support from the Biden administration. That's the Thacker Pass mine that is under construction right now. And so it's not only the case that there's a lot of public financing to support mining in the US and in Europe, but also that this spans partisan lines or spans the ideological spectrum, that governments, right and left will support mining. In the EU, there's not as much access to these kinds of tax breaks and also some of the public financing mechanisms that we've had in the US, but there's still been significant investing in critical mineral sectors. And very recently, just about a week ago, the EU Commission has proposed to use this new $400 billion competitiveness fund to purchase and stockpile critical minerals, also to coordinate the supply chain. And that's actually been framed as a way that they are kind of copying US policies. So across the Atlantic, across the political spectrum, we see policymakers willing to use public money to attract mining to the West. And this is to a degree working, we might say. I mean, it's not going to get Europe self-sufficient in lithium tomorrow or maybe ever, but it is certainly increasing the number of lithium mines being proposed and permitted and potentially financed within both the US and EU. So in the US, you have a bunch of projects that are in exploration or in some cases under construction or receiving early permits, especially in the western part of the US, as displayed in this map. Of course, many of those projects are purely speculative. Some of them are quite small, but might be combined with nearby projects to create a bigger project that then is sold to a larger mining company. So we know that mining is speculative and uncertain at the early stages, but to even have this many projects that are under some degree of consideration is a big shift. Similarly, in the EU, which is even more dependent than the US on imports of minerals, we see a bunch of mining projects being proposed. This isn't even a complete list. This is an older graphic, and I haven't been able to find a more contemporary graphic. So there's a few projects that are missing from here. And though it says the project in Serbia, which is outside the EU, but close enough to be of interest to EU officials, has been axed due to popular protests, it's now actually back on the table potentially. So we should follow those events closely. And so, yes, this is a major change where Western countries might kind of self-provide some of their own mining versus it relying on imports. But it's very important to note, first of all, how dependent on ongoing public support this is, especially due to the price uncertainty and volatility, but also the geopolitical turbulence. Mining companies really rely on the state to send them clear signals that a project is of national security interest, but also to literally send them money to then attract private investment on top of that. But, alongside all of this activity in the global north, there is lots of even more activity in the global south, right? So this is not a replacement for global south mining. It is in addition to it. And I'll come back to the global south, a little bit later in the talk. But beforehand, I want to pivot to who the companies and investors are that are on the receiving end of all of this public money, and also what some of the corporate strategies have been in these supply chains that in many ways, the corporate strategies, as we'll see, mirror some of the public policy strategies. There's we could say an elective affinity across the public and private sector in terms of how supply chains are being reorganized. And so when I refer to green capitalists or green capitalism here, and I'm happy to talk more about what I mean by that term more conceptually, but I simply mean lithium firms, batteries firms, EV manufacturers, and the financial, investors in those same entities. And so what do we see them doing? Similar to how states are incentivizing onshoring, downstream firms, so the EV and battery companies, are to some degree vertically reintegrating, meaning instead of relying on free trade or global commodity markets to obtain the raw materials and minerals they need, they're directly investing in mines, sometimes in the very same mines that governments are also supporting. So these mines are getting downstream investment from the private sector as well as public money. And maybe just to take one example of that, this is an infographic from the Financial Times. It's just one of 6 pages of a long list of how automakers are directly investing in mining and mining companies. On the right side, we have an example of that where the US automaker General Motors has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the very same mine, Thacker Pass, that's in the southwestern US, that's under construction now, for which the Biden government in the US also gave an enormous loan to, and the Trump government now is a direct investor in, right? So that's a great example of how supply chain security and onshoring work alongside vertical reintegration. There are other trends in green capitalism, and that I'm not going to get into in detail in this talk, but I just mention them in case people want to ask me or if there's any interest. So this is the financialization of the lithium market. We should never take it for granted that a resource sector is automatically or easily financialized, or made into a more typical kind of global commodity market. But lithium is kind of in the process of becoming what analysts would call a mature commodity, and I'm happy to talk about what that means. And then, kind of linked to the financialization in interesting ways, there are these attempts to green lithium, or greenwash it, we might say, and this works through the private certification industry, but it also works through financial vehicles that kind of designate certain lithium mines or companies as more sustainable than others, and plays a role in how those lithium companies obtain investment on better terms. So these are some interesting trends, we might say, in the world of green capitalism. But some of them, especially when we combine them with what states are doing, also point to certain internal contradictions or tensions within the world of green capitalism. And I just maybe want to focus on the first one. The others I list in case there's interest in talking about them in the Q&A. But, I think the main contradiction is that firms, whether they are mining firms getting direct, government subsidies, whether they are downstream firms that are also benefiting from government tax breaks or from consumer rebates, there's broad acceptance and enthusiasm among firms for receiving tax breaks, subsidies, public financing. What there isn't enthusiasm for is rerouting entire supply chains to exclude China or to decouple from China. And so firms have to play this complex strategic game of ensuring they get governmental support while not necessarily abiding by some of the strings that are attached to that governmental support, or maybe deferring how much they do so. And so there is just this tension between the benefits of onshoring and some of the costs of onshoring for firms across the supply chain. But where I want to pivot to for the kind of last portions of the talk are other actors in the world that aren't necessarily these really powerful states and corporations, but are instead less powerful states, and also ultimately the social movements that I will turn to at the very end of the talk. So, you know, even though global north governments are incentivizing more mining, within their jurisdictions, within their borders, than would have been the case without all that government support, it is still the case that global south countries will provide a lot of the minerals, or at least are forecasted to provide a lot of the minerals for the energy transition. And in terms of specific regions and countries, Latin America, Africa, and Indonesia are some of the top places that minerals will really come from for these global supply chains. And so that fact has incentivized governments in the global south to think about how they can benefit and how their societies can benefit potentially from this boom in critical minerals mining and from the broader supply chains that they are inputs for. So that has occasioned a renewal of interest in what is called resource nationalism. It has occasioned specific nationalizations, new state-owned companies, export bans or quotas to limit how much raw materials can leave the country without some downstream refining, processing, or even industrialization. It's occasioned ideas for more producer coordination along the lines of OPEC, but for critical minerals. And so we see a flurry of interesting policy ideas out of the global south to leverage their resource deposits into developmental goals and industrialization and diversification goals. But of course, this is perhaps easier said than done. And while some of those policies I just listed have had some success, and I don't want to downplay that, in a lot of countries, it's been hard to really make the leap from having lithium, for example, in your country to developing a lithium battery supply chain. And so I like to think of, four sets of dilemmas that global South states face. in attempting to do both resource nationalism and also green industrial policy. One is that, of course, it's hard to get firms to uh, really transfer the technology to it's hard to get multinational or foreign firms to transfer the technology so that your domestic firms can learn and build these domestic supply chains. There has been some positive or I think we could say positive or at least interesting developments on this front where Chinese firms, private sector firms, are really increasingly engaged in investing in industrial activities in the global south related to these energy transition sectors. So we have a boom in what we could call green FDI, green foreign direct investment coming from China to the global south, where it's not just that China is exporting lithium batteries or solar panels, but also that they're setting up manufacturing sites in countries in Latin America, Africa, South Asia to produce those things domestically. And that is, I think, a positive development, but there have also been some new restrictions coming out of China to limit how much of the technological, let's say, intellectual property is really transferred to local firms in those countries, right? So we still see these tensions happen, even if there's been some forward movement on green industrialization. There's, of course, geopolitical tensions where countries may feel like they have to choose sides between the West and China in order to access those markets for their own exports. There are the classic distributive dilemmas of extractive sectors where they're prone to conflicts over, who gets the economic benefit. Is it, the profits of the foreign company? Is it royalties and taxes that go to the national coffers, the kind of budget of the national state should it be distributed to local communities? So there's a lot of distributive conflicts around extractive sectors, even if we don't think of the complexity of downstream industrialization. And this is where we'll get into the final part of the talk, we also have a lot of environmental and social protest against critical minerals mining in the global south. And so governments that might want to leverage those mineral sectors in order to stimulate broader development are also targeted by protesters who don't agree with a specific mining project or with an expansion of mining writ large. And so that's, how I make the argument that social movements are relevant to political economy because they're shaping public policies, they're shaping the kind of political space that governments operate in. And in some cases, if a protest is successful, they might also reduce or temporarily limit supply coming out of a certain mine, or they might limit the ability of investors to invest in a mine because the mine might be cut off or protested so militantly that it's not going to move forward at all. And so we see around the world, actually, and especially in Latin America, many examples of anti-mining movements able to actually stall an investment or stall a project. And so that I think is a clear way in which they are relevant to global markets, supply and demand, and the supply chains themselves. And so what we see around the world, if we look at the lithium sector, is that kind of wherever the lithium sector moves, we have new forms of protest. So in the early 2000s, the main examples of protests were really in South America. The main examples of lithium of protests related to lithium mines were in South America. As onshoring started to take hold, we started to see protests in the global north or in what we might call like the semi-peripheries of the global north as well, like Serbia, but also in the Iberian Peninsula, in the United States. And then that's also paired with ongoing and sometimes more recent episodes of quite contentious protest in Chile and Argentina. So this is not to say that everywhere lithium is extracted, there's protest, or everywhere a mine is planned, there's protest, but just that on the whole, we have a frequency of protest and a correlation between the mutation of the map of lithium mining and where we see civil society responses. That can look like militant blockades at the sites of extraction. It can look like protests, mass protests in capital cities to change public policy and prevent government from encouraging the mining. It can look like protest camps at the site of mining, so it takes different forms. It's interesting, I think, always to visit communities before the mining has taken place and see how actually in that moment before the mining project even exists, there can be really quite militant opposition. And sometimes the militancy is even more intense before mining than it is once the mining actually takes hold. And on the right side, I'll just note that this landscape now looks different. This was during my field work a few years ago, but that mine is now under construction in Thacker Pass, the mine that I've referred to a few times. And so, I think, as I've argued that we should take social movements seriously as collective actors that shape the political economy of extraction, we can also, I think, see them as a form of environmental governance. And in oftentimes states are absent in terms of the basics of regulation and monitoring. And social movements fill in for that role, but also are themselves the source of very interesting policy ideas for how to reshape these sectors. And, just to close out, and this will next will come my final slide of the talk. Um, it also, I think that the fact that protests tends to occur or proliferate as these critical mineral sectors kind of move around the world, I think raises a broader question of how much mining do we actually need, and are all these new projects necessary? I started the talk by showing us some forecasts of, 400 new mines just for car batteries over the next decade. And some of the most exciting work that I've been involved in, aside from the book itself, has been joining a team of modelers at a think tank that I'm active in, the Climate and Community Institute, to actually demonstrate that while more lithium mining will be necessary for the energy transition, we don't necessarily have to mine as much in the volumes that are predicted by the kind of mainstream forecasting agencies. And instead, we could actually reach our goal of eliminating emissions from transportation in the US, for example, with less mining than those most alarming forecasts if we make some changes to transportation policy, to how Americans move around, and to also land use planning, as well as to recycling of batteries. Those are some of the major tools that governments have at their disposal to reduce the resource intensity of the energy transition and therefore reduce environmental impacts, social conflicts, and hopefully geopolitical tensions as well. So I will close it there, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.